Malcolm Bradbury wrote The History Man in 1975. It's set in 1972 in the fictional University of Watermouth, where trendy Dr. Howard Kirk lectures in sociology. He sleeps around with his female colleagues and students, manipulates his head of department into inviting a controversial speaker, and mobilizes opinion to engineer the dismissal of a student he dislikes, always letting others pay the price, not least his own wife.
I had written 2 novels before, both of them in the spirit of affable liberalism, you might say. And the novel that I wanted to write about the late 60s was a much sourer and more ironic novel, a book about the kind of changes that were taking place to liberalism, which is one of the things that I'm always preoccupied by as a novelist, and the changes that were being introduced by sociology, and particularly a kind of behaviorist sociology, which was becoming extremely fashionable at the time.
It was television director Robert Knights who first thought of making an adaptation.
The extraordinary thing was, looking back from 78, from the hindsight of 78, 79, one started to realize that it was almost like looking back 300-400 years towards the Restoration. One had a sense of suddenly this extraordinary 8 years distance was in fact felt like 400 years, and the tremendous shenanigans and fun and theatricality of the 60s had stopped dead. So it was like looking at a museum piece. We felt in the 60s that anything was possible and it would last for a long time. It certainly didn't. That's why I wanted to do it.
There were 6 new universities actually founded, but there was a 7th proposed, which was never built except by me. The 7th was at Bournemouth, and I decided to populate the unfilled site for my novel, and that was the way in which I set myself the task of inventing a new university which had characteristics that it shared with the other 6, but wasn't about any one of the existing universities.
Bradbury's readers could imagine his University of Watermouth. Rob Knight's viewers had to see real buildings. Of the 6 English universities built in the 1960s, only Lancaster would let him use their campus. The interiors were built Lancaster style in the BBC studios in Birmingham. The town of Watermouth, supposedly on the south coast, was created partly from nearby Coventry, partly from Bristol, where Annie Callender's flat was in a real house, with a real sea view, but with a studio interior. The Kirk's house was also in Bristol, even if its kitchen was in Pebble Mill.
Detail in television is very interesting in its relationship to the original novel. In a novel, if you describe something, if you suddenly decide to describe a kitchen, that is a very dramatic thing to do, in the sense that you have chosen at this point in this story suddenly to highlight a certain element of the background and put it into the foreground.
Howard goes into the kitchen. He stands in front of the wallpaper celebrating the lines of onions and garlics. He stands in front of the pine shelves with their scatter of selected objects, the French casseroles, the row of hand-thrown pottery mugs in light brown, the 2 peppermills, the line of deep blue Spanish glasses from Casa Pupo, the dark brown pot saying Sel. In front of him in a rush basket lie 10 long French loaves. Howard stands at the pine table and neatly, crisply he slices the crusty bread.
That's not usually the way it works in television. A background is a background, and it remains there, and it's quite hard, I think, to spark off the same kind of effect about things that can be created in a novel. So in The History Man, there is obsession with things. It's a very thingy book, and what I'm trying to suggest in that is that one of the things that we do in contemporary history is actually use things as history. That is to say, fashions function terribly importantly in human life, that we identify ourselves, that we name ourselves by the things that we buy and the labels that we have on our goods.
I don't like cornflakes. Look, would you mind exercising a bit of parental authority and getting to eat his sodding cornflakes? Are you going to eat your sodding cornflakes, or do you want me to throw them out of the window?
Throw them out of the window.
Christ, a man who's been professionally trained as a social psychologist. He can't even get a child to eat a cornflake.
Well, why don't you give them wider options? Weetabix, Rice Krispies.
Mind your own business. I feed this lot. It's not wider options they want, it's my endless sodding attention.
It is wider options we want.
We want the endless sodding attention as well.
Will you eat your cornflakes? Otherwise you'll die.
Wonderful.
You don't have to go to school if you're dead. They give your crayons to another person.
Will you shut up?
In this novel, it's practically entirely dialogue. This makes it much easier for adapting for television and for film. With a camera, you can show what happens between people. You can show what a single person does, but you can practically never show what they think. If a novel is based very much on what's going on inside somebody's skull, I would say fairly clearly it's not a suitable candidate for adaptation.
A feature of Malcolm Bradbury's style is that his verbs are without adverbs. He doesn't indicate tones of voice or accents. Did this help or hinder the adapter?
When I first started writing for the theatre, I added a great many of those sorts of stage directions which instruct the actor to say things angrily, coldly, warmly, or sardonically. And I found that this was a great annoyance to actors. And so I stopped doing it. And unless the line calls for a radically different tone of voice than the line suggests, I do leave that to the actors. So I didn't find that a difficulty either. I mean, I think it's the adverbs are the job of the actors.
I make it almost a rule to try and take out, when the writer has put in various adverbs, to try and take them out of the scripts that are presented to the actors. I don't want to give them hints like that. Those have to be found in rehearsal. Shakespeare doesn't put in adverts, nor does Molière. It's a very good idea to keep them out.
Nearly all The History Man is written in the present tense. Did this affect the process of adaptation?
No, I found that a great help because, of course, a drama is in the present tense. It's happening in front of you. And the immediacy of the book, that tone, translated very easily, I thought, into dramatic immediacy. So that was an asset rather than a hindrance.
In the novel, there are 13 chapters of roughly equal length. 11 of them cover a few weeks, the first 2 days of a university term, a few days later, and the last day of term. But chapters 2 and 3 take the form of a flashback written in the past tense and covering the previous 15 years. In the television play there are 4 episodes, covering the 3 principal days of the action, but omitting the flashback altogether.
Well, I felt that to include it, apart from getting us into a length problem, because the prescribed length of the adaptation was 4 hours, it would really disrupt the unity of the piece. I wanted the first episode to be the first day of term, and I felt that had a neatness which was more valuable than inserting a number of flashbacks.
I think the problem of not having it there is that something of the motivation, something of the past that feeds the present in the story is missing. That is to say that Howard Kirk and Barbara, the dominant couple, do actually have a history of ups and downs, of one being on top and one being underneath and so on, which in part explains the struggle that is taking place between them over the few short days when the main story occurs.
The way I attempted to deal with it was to make a good many references to that past, particularly references made by Henry and Myra, who were the couple who knew Howard and Barbara back in the days when they were different in Leeds or wherever it is. And it had the additional dramatic benefits that when Myra said something like, "You used to be such a quiet little chap," it threw the past character and the present character into relief at a particular moment which was emphasized by Howard's obvious displeasure at being reminded that he was once a meek and humble servant of sociology and not the media whiz kid that he was in the process of turning himself into.
Look. You remember that time Howard and I split up in Leeds?
I can see you now standing on the doorstep with your saucepan and your portable towel.
Yes, well, we talked ourselves through that.
Yeah, you see, ours hasn't been one marriage, it's been several.
And the amazing thing is you've both changed so much. Especially you, Howard. You used to be such a quiet, hard-working little lad till Barbara got hold of you. I don't know how you managed it.
What do you mean?
You've got such a good relationship.
Everyone's life looks easier from the outside.
Oh, come on, yours is the most successful academic marriage I know. Everybody else we know is fighting or separating or divorcing or running off with alpha students.
In the novel, Bradbury mocks sociology in many ways, not least with some of its own jargon. Here, Howard explains the subject to two new students.
Howard takes the girls across to the window. He shows them the glass and concrete view. He tells them about Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. He says, how else could you know why the world has become what it is?
In Hampton's adaptation, this sentence becomes a scene. The jargon goes. Howard blinds the girls, not with science, but with evangelical fervour. The effect of this change is heightened by a clever transition to the next scene, emphasising Kirk as an activist of sociology.
It sounds pretty important.
Absolutely. It's the only genuinely relevant subject in the curriculum. And it's entirely comprehensive. It takes in everything. Decimal currency, Rhodesia, abortion, Coronation Street, you name it. You'll finally begin to learn something about life. We'll visit prisons and factories, hospitals. I'll take you to the law courts and the Salvation Army hostels. It's a question of opening your minds. Now just keep your eyes open and see if you can come up with an answer to what seems to me will be one of the crucial questions of the 70s. Just at the moment of maximum entropy, when late capitalist structures are beginning to fall in on themselves, those of us in the vanguard of the struggle have suddenly been afflicted with an unaccountable paralysis.
As a television director, Rob Knight's had an extra dimension not available to the novelist: music.
The three levels of music in the film. There's the level of music which is incidental music from the 60s and very early 70s, records and so on. Now the important thing about that is all of the music is slightly out of date. Howard Kirk, his choice of music would have stopped probably around the Rolling Stones' Gimme Shelter. It is a point that I'm trying to make, that like all of us, your choice of popular music stops at a certain age. Second level is a quotation from Mozart, Don Giovanni. It's used to calm the pace. It's a song of seduction when Don Giovanni talks to Zelina. It has a very important function, which is to calm it, but also perhaps for those of the audience who pick it up, to remind them that the Howard Kirks have been around a long time. Don Giovanni, Tartuffe for just two examples. The third element is George Fenton's music, which is not to tell the interior states of the characters, but it is to give an 80s version of what was happening in the 70s. It's parody. It's a joyous celebration of some of the music which was around to provide a perspective, the sense that we're having fun. For instance, when Howard Kirk first goes onto the campus on the first day, there's a music which sounds like 400 Brazilian referees' whistles all going off. It provides a sort of samba of pleasure at the possibility of mayhem and destruction that he's going to start on the first day of term.
The main loss to any novel when it's transferred into television, I think, is that this version becomes imprinted and fixed with extraordinary certitude in the minds of far more people than ever read the novel. And I can recognize the impact of this on myself. When I first imagined Howard Kirk, I didn't imagine anybody who looked at all like Anthony Sher. And Anthony Sher, for me now, is Howard Kirk and is the history man. That process of dramatic conversion from an imaginary being into a sort of a real being, I think is an extraordinary event. When you write drama, you want that to happen. When you write fiction, you are trying not to make it happen in a way. That is to say, one of the things I actually did in The History Man was not to say what Howard looks like. But nonetheless, I knew.
When Anthony Sher was first offered the part of Howard Kirk, had he read the original novel?
No, I hadn't. I'm afraid I hadn't even heard of it. Shame to admit. No, Rob Knight just turned up on my doorstep one day and had this pile of scripts and the novel lying on top of it, and handed them over and said, this is for you if you want it, which was a beautiful way to give one something as important as that. And he said at that time, as he handed it over, he said, please do me a favor and read the scripts first before we read the novel, so that you encounter the character and indeed the story through Christopher Hampton, as 'twere, rather than Malcolm Bradbury, and then by all means read the novel.
Having read the novel, what did he make of the 2 flashback chapters about the Kirk's earlier life?
It's the only point where the television version differs quite drastically from the book. Discovering that in that section, Howard is much more sympathetic indeed, and that you see the genesis of man, you understand why he's become the way he has, and you realize how totally reversed the roles were between him and Barbara originally. And that helps you fill in, even though the audience aren't going to see that in the television version, it helps you fill in the character for yourself.
The novel hints at Howard Kirk's appearance, but says nothing about his voice.
Malcolm does mention that he's from Yorkshire originally, and that he's from a working-class family. So that was obviously the starting point. And then Rob Knight, the director, and I just kind of decided that he would have lost most of that, because he fancies himself as this media person and goes on television and does chat shows and things. And that perhaps he would also develop a slight, that slight mid-Atlantic thing, which was, became very trendy in the 70s, still is, that the people in the record business and in the media use. And that was something that I let him kind of slip into when talking to his students more, a way of, in a peculiar way, a way in which he was patronizing them, but of course he would never admit that, but where he was like putting himself more on their level and talking to them as equals. And then at other times, in some of the more emotional stuff, I'd let his accent come out much more when he loses his temper or whatever, as it naturally would with someone who had suppressed their own natural accent.
When I saw episode 1, I was worried and uneasy, and I felt that this wasn't the Howard Kirk that I knew, and that a significant part of the story had been missed out, which was the prehistory of the story. As I watched episode 2, my mind began to change. I suddenly realized that I was watching a major performance by a major actor, and I found that by making the scene the present, a great deal of the story was actually being carried, and that a lot of the problems had been solved. Problems that I was afraid were not going to be solved were being solved as it went on. By the time I got to the end of it, I thought it was magic. I was very impressed indeed, and very much convinced by the prime performances, the major performances.
Did Christopher Hampton invent any totally new scenes?
Yes, particularly in the last episode, where there's a faculty meeting, which is not in the book, in which Howard finally pushes through his twin plan, i.e. to invite Professor Mangleland to get rid of the wretched Carmody. And then there's a final scene which was my invention, and my idea, really, which I really wanted to put in, which is a final scene between Howard and Beamish, Henry Beamish, when Howard goes to visit the unfortunate fellow in hospital. And Henry finally tells Howard what he thinks of him. Henry is a very important character in the book. So much is implied in the little preface that Malcolm writes in which Beamish appears. And I felt that he needed to sign off in a memorable way, so I invented this scene.
Very kind, Howard.
Not at all.
I'm not very well placed for peeling them, but I'm sure something could be contrived.
Oh, yes.
The bananas are especially thoughtful.
I hope you don't blame me for this, Henry.
You want everything, don't you?
What I don't understand is why you were so provocative. Why didn't you just tell them Mangle was dead?
Suppose they cheered or laughed. I couldn't have stood that.
It's very unfortunate, Henry, but that was not the moment to abandon your well-known talent for seeing the other person's point of view.
It's not your point of view I dislike, Howard. It's you.
I see.
It's never, you see, the causes one objects to. Generally speaking, the causes are admirable. It's those who rise on the backs of those causes.
Well, it's only natural you're upset. I'll leave you now and pop back in a day or two.
No, don't.
Don't leave you?
No, don't come back.
All adaptations are provisional. The novel exists. That was its original form. That is the original form the author chose to tell his story. That will exist long after all adaptations have come and gone. An adaptation is simply a version of that story. Dennis Potter somewhere describes adaptations as being a loving form of criticism.
We expect our Shakespeare to change every few years. We expect it to change with every director. And the same is true, it seems to me, of a really good television adaptation.
It's right that an adaptation should be a group piece of work. It's not a cottage industry. Cottage industry being what an author does all by himself, on his own, out of his own mind. When we make an adaptation, it's a whole film unit, it's actors, it's the whole combination of a group of different talents that try to come together to tell the story.
If Rob Knights were now to have the chance of directing another television adaptation of The History Man, would he want to change anything?
Oh, yes. I'd do it a totally different way. I'd probably do it in 2 hours rather than 4 hours. And one of the things that I would do now is I'd try and find a way of telling Barbara's story. You see in the book very clearly, because of the past, Barbara's experiences, her taking up the feminism, then her disillusionment. Now, that is not easy to dramatize, but I'm very aware that in our 4-hour version, Barbara is almost a static character. From the start, she is disillusioned.
Doesn't it worry you that so many of our friends feel like that nowadays? Tired and desperate. But why is it? Is it our age? Is it that the political excitement's all gone? What's the matter? Our sort of people never used to think life was silly.
Don't let it get you down. Take a Valium.
It's all wrong.
Steadily, it will move towards her suicide attempt. But she's the great character that we've left out of our adaptation.
Once I was strong, but I